Good morning, class. Welcome to today's lesson. Today we begin Unit 3 and we will be looking at an introduction to environmental problems. Now, environmental problems, this topic is actually quite vast. So what we will actually be doing in this unit, we would really be looking at an overview of some of the major current environmental threats and issues that we are dealing with in our time. So we will first start by actually trying to define the problem. So environmental threats have been increasing significantly within the last 200 years. And the reason we've identified the last 200 years or so, that's just a rough estimate. What we would have observed is that if we look at the second point, we see that these threats have actually shown a parallel pattern with increasing human interaction with our environment, which also seems to have a direct correlation to increasing population growth and industrial activities. Now we know the Industrial Revolution. We know at this point that the Industrial Revolution was really birthed in around the 18th century, 1700s, thereabouts, and it has continued since then. That continued and increasing human interaction with our environment has actually created a number of unanticipated environmental and even human health problems that we were not able to foresee. And unfortunately for us in our generation, and even the generation prior, this is when the accumulative effects of those interactions and interruptions in the natural processes seem to become evident, and we are seeing the effects on our environment and human health, right? So the threats, they're quite varied, and they affect, as I said before, not only our natural environment around us, but there's also a feedback loop to human health. So increasingly so, we're beginning to realize that the environment does not occur in isolation from human beings. Human beings depend on our environment for survival. So we are actually an integral part of our environment. So the things that we do will affect us. Now, since the Earth Summit of 1992 that occurred in Rio de Janeiro of that year, that was a pretty significant UN summit, there has been growing global awareness of the seriousness of these environmental threats and the need to find ways to arrest its progress. So the awareness, as we say, there's been increasing awareness, and as knowledge and understanding of our environment continues to grow, the more we understand is the more we realize that we don't understand, because there's such a complex relationship between human beings and the environment, and even different aspects of the environment as they relate to each other. Now, what we have here is really a summary of some of those major threats that we were just talking about. All right. Now, at the very top, I've placed population growth because we find, as I mentioned before, that there seems to be a direct correlation to the increasing environmental threats that we are experiencing now and population growth. So we know that just around the time that we find that the Industrial Revolution was really beginning to take off and impact not only global economies, but the populations as well, we find increasing population growth. That increasing population growth over time has led in many parts of the world to what we can define as overpopulation. So we have to be careful when we talk about overpopulation, because overpopulation is not necessarily a specific number of persons that you're looking at, but overpopulation is really defined in relation to the amount of natural resources you have available to sustain a population. So we can have some countries that can be defined as underpopulated and some that are overpopulated. Where natural resources are being overwhelmed and there is risk that the natural resources cannot continue to sustain the population size, we define that as overpopulation. But when we look at the global numbers now, we see that global consumption of our natural resources is far greater, and therefore the threat that those resources may not be available for future population is also great, right? So also in many parts of the world as well, where you find an increasing population growth, we find increasing urbanization. So we have this concept of urban sprawl. So we have changing landscapes that are occurring, where the landscape is now becoming urbanized in nature. Natural habitats and natural landscape are being threatened and are disappearing at the expense of this urban sprawl. We have higher population densities in urban areas and all the challenges that can come with that. So when we have urban sprawl now, we can expect to see a disappearance of our natural, or threats rather, to our natural ecological processes. So for example, where you have, for example, you've removed natural land cover and you have a lot of concrete, you now see that it's going to affect your, it affects the hydrological cycle, because now you will have increased surface runoff that can lead to increased flooding. We will have reduced soil water infiltration because the water can no longer easily and readily infiltrate the soil, so that increases the runoff, and we have increased flooding occurrences, and of course a whole lot of other things that can come out of that. Related to all of this now, especially where we have growing populations, increasing urban centers, increased industrial activities, we find we have an increasing problem of pollution. Now we can categorize pollution into three general areas. We have our air pollution, water pollution, and land pollution. Air pollution is often characterized by the emissions that are produced from the burning of fossil fuels. So fossil fuels would include things like oil, coal, natural gas, and all of these emissions can contribute to global warming, where we have a general warming of the atmosphere. And that global warming now can lead to things like sea level rise, where we have the melting of the ice caps. That global warming also can contribute to the acidification of our oceans, where the pH of our oceans now become more acidic. That where that happens now, we can affect marine ecosystems. For example, we find the bleaching, coral reef bleaching can occur as a result of ocean acidification. And then, of course, we have climate change that can occur. We have changes in weather patterns, increasing severity of different weather phenomena. So we will get into the climate change effects in the other block that we can see there. Then we have water pollution, increases in water pollution. For example, we have increased runoff from industrial and domestic wastewater. That runoff can also come from agricultural activities, getting into our water sources, from increased use of fertilizers in order to try to increase crop yield to satisfy that increasing population demand, chemicals, pesticides, because what you have is where you have a lot of monoculture taking place, you also find an increased incidence of pests. Whereas when you have mixed agricultural processes that would have traditionally taken place before the Green Revolution advances, pests were not as great a problem as it is now. They did have they did have pest problem, which is why in the ancient days you find they would actually have periods where the ground would be left fallow. Those natural processes would have taken care of all of those things like that. But now, what is happening with commercial agricultural processes, the soils are not being left to rest at all. So it depletes the soil of its nutrients. Um, when that happens, we use increased fertilizers and pesticides, and then we increase the risk of runoff with our changing landscapes. That runs off into our natural water courses, rivers, groundwater storage, that now actually changes the aquatic environment, causing a buildup of algae growth, um, suffocating any organisms re- that may require oxygen in order to survive in those environments. Then we have land pollution. Land pollution would involve things like a buildup of solid waste, because the more people you have is the more waste you will have. So you have increasing solid waste generation occurring. As this increase, what do we do with them? We have to find ways to manage the waste. Typically, we use landfills. That's not necessarily the best way to go, because land is finite. Land will run out. For example, here in Trinidad and Tobago, the Beetham landfill has already expired its lifespan. It's way, way past. It should have been closed a long time ago. But the challenges are, what alternatives do they have if they cannot use the Beetham landfill? Um, this means then that there are many solid waste management challenges that land pollution, increasing land pollution leads us to, and that brings us to a place where we have to look at what we call solid waste, integrated solid waste management options that may include looking at things like what strategies can we do to reduce the generation of waste? So maybe reuse, recycle. Um, how can we eliminate it altogether? And there are many things that we could look at. So integrated solid waste management is becoming more and more important in the times that we live in. Let's go to our climate change. So we're on the climate change block now. Um, Climate change, what we have is a situation where, because of all these increased human interactions with our environment, we have increased carbon dioxide buildup in our atmosphere due to, as mentioned before, that increased fossil fuel consumption. Um, that, along with other gases being released into the atmosphere, leads to ozone depletion. Now, in recent times, we've been hearing that the ozone hole in the atmosphere, I think, is the one over the Antarctic in the south. I may be wrong, but you all can research that. It has been healing. Um, Even during the period of this 2020 period with the COVID, where many parts of the world had been in lockdown for periods of time, apparently the scientists had been finding that there had been some repair during that period of time to the ozone depletion, because there was a reduced amount of those emissions into the atmosphere. With the depletion of the ozone layer, we found that a lot of increased UV rays and those types of energy signatures would be entering our atmosphere, causing other kinds of problems for both the plant and animal life, um, as well as other environmental problems. Um, the emissions released into the atmosphere will mix with the moisture in the atmosphere to create acid rain. That acid rain, again, we know could destroy um, plants, which can contribute to food insecurity, destruction to human infrastructure, etc. Contamination of our water sources, in terms of changing the pH of our water sources. Um, those increased global temperatures, as we mentioned before, would lead to sea level rise. A significant contribution to that sea level rise would be the melting of the ice caps. What happens when we have sea level rise? Destruction of coastal ecosystems can take place. That puts small island states like Trinidad and Tobago puts us at risk, as we find that we begin to lose not only coastal ecosystems through drowning, but actual land mass. The ocean acidification, as mentioned before, can lead to the destruction of ocean habitats such as coral reefs, seagrass beds, etc. Remember what the important functions of those types of features are. So when we have destruction of those features, we now lose a certain amount of coastal protection as well. We also have increased severity of weather patterns, where we have extremes of weather, for example, very dry periods that can lead to drought, very wet periods that can lead to floods. We have increasing number of hurricanes occurring, and not only increasing frequency of those hurricanes, but um, the increasing severity of the power generated from those hurricanes. When we hear about, increasing occurrences of category 4 and category 5 hurricanes, in some parts of the world you have harsher winters, etc. So we have a lot of environmental consequences coming out of climate change. Then if we go to water scarcity, this is another environmental threat and another environmental problem that is increasing worldwide. With climate change, we find those increasing incidents of drought can lead to lower levels of water supply being available. Right here in Trinidad and Tobago, we've been having some harsher dry seasons than we've had in years gone by, and that has actually been made even more um, serious this year with in 2020, as we are dealing with the coronavirus and the increasing importance of our ability to maintain a certain level of personal hygiene and sanitation. In the absence of sufficient water, we are now at an increased risk of disease. Um, then water scarcity would also apply not only in terms of the amount of actual physical water available to you, but also the quality of the water. In many parts of the world, poor quality of the water available um, would be due to many of the issues or contributors of pollution that we talked about. And in poor countries, water treatment infrastructure is maybe not up to standard, or in some parts of the world non-existent at all. So that poor water quality can lead to all kinds of illness, diarrhea, cholera, um, and many other types of human health illness. Those things can also lead to malnutrition as well. Okay, then we also have to look at the issue of diminishing resources, our diminishing natural resources. So remember, we live in an industrial world. Every part of the world, um, for many of us, our countries are motivated to improve economies and standard of living, and the go-to direction for a very long time has always been to increase industrialization. That increase in industrialization leads to an increased consumption of our natural resources. For example, we find that increasing consumption can lead to problems of deforestation, where we cut down the forest for things like lumber for furniture and various things like that, medicines. Deforestation can also lead to soil degradation. But remember, I also mentioned soil degradation can also come from the commercial farming type practices where we find they practice monoculture, which depletes the integrity of the soil. So now the soil is being degenerated from in two ways. Not only agriculture, but remember deforestation, making space for agricultural activity. Um, that means that crop reduces crop yields, not only in terms of amounts, but also the quality of the crops. Because what we're finding in recent years as well is that the food that we eat, when our ancestors consume the same food, the very same food, the amount of nutrients that they would have gotten out of the same food that we eat today is much less today. So we're not only reducing the amount of crops that is being produced, but we're also reducing the quality of the food, the nutrient levels of the food. Then we also have a problem of overfishing. Overfishing to meet the needs of our growing populations. Many parts of the world we find that fish stocks are depleting, some species are even disappearing as well. Then we have increased consumption of our non-renewable resources for energy. Getting back again to that issue of fossil fuel consumption. So where we have increased industrialization, we have increased consumption of various types of non-renewable resources in order to power the industry, which is why more and more we find that if we are moving towards any kind of sustainable development, we have to look at our options in renewable resource energy, such as solar energy, wind energy, hydroelectric power, etc. And then at the bottom here, we have another problem of food insecurity. So again, some of the previous points, this issue would have come up already. So where we have famine from drought, we find there would be a lack of access to food. So there's insufficient food. Where we have insufficient food, we can also have problems with the quality of food in poor countries. So for example, in poor countries, they will tend to go for the cheaper food that's readily available, like for example, lots of rice, lots of flour, things like that. And of course, when you think about that, that's not really a balanced diet. So even though they would be getting something to fill their bellies, it's not a balanced diet. So we have increasing instances of malnutrition, not starvation, but malnutrition, which can lead to poor health. And what we find now happening as a result is that we have an increasing burden on health services. So this is just a summary of some of the major threats. There are others. We've only looked at an overview of the issues here. But hopefully you all can also see from this little chart that we have here that summarizes our point, there is a link between and amongst many of them, which is why you find that I put population growth and the issue of population all the way at the top here as an umbrella point, because it touches everything. So what is the final word? What do we want to make sure we get out of this lesson? All right, here are some important points to remember. So we have increasing environmental threats, and that if they are left unchecked, can paint a very bleak picture of our future. So intervention is needed. Intervention in the form of sustainable development. Sustainable development where we can, because in order to exist, we have to consume resources. There's just no way around it. When we consume, we produce waste. But how can we do these things in a wise and manageable way that we do not continue to accelerate and even create these environmental problems on a level that the earth cannot cope with? We want to make sure that we leave something for the future for the future generations in the environment. So it is very clear that much of the environmental challenges we face today can be connected back to human interaction with our environment. Sorry about that, there's a typo there. It is important for us to make major and necessary changes to slow the progress of environmental quality decline for the sake of not only future generations but also our own. As this present situation, it is currently now a clear and present danger because we are seeing the effects of it now. Even our generation is experiencing it. So I want to thank you for joining me for today's summary lesson. I direct you to eClassroom for today's lesson for the activities planned for this week. Thank you for joining me.